wings crack. Posters of old rodeos eventually become torn and crumpled. People get old. Desire fades. Lovers leave you. You get burned out and have nothing to say. Everything changes. If things are good now, they'll eventually get worse. If things are bad now, they'll eventually get better. This is what we wish Alexander could have known on his terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. This is the Buddha's law of impermanence. The first of the three characteristics of existence, which are impermanence, suffering, and no self, which is the lack of a permanent self and the interconnection of everything. You have to learn to let go of what was, no matter how pleasant, when it changes. To be present to what is, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, which means neither pleasant nor unpleasant, is the path to believing in this living without it being a hard way to go. Impermanence comes on many scales. It comes on the scale of illness, old age, and death. And it also comes on the scale of subtle energy flows through our bodies, accompanying the various emotions we have. Learning to read these emotional flows brings a great deal of freedom to our lives. We can't let go of unpleasant energy flows like anger or suffering just by deciding to do so. We have to observe the energy flows with precision and no resistance until letting go just happens. We begin a Buddhist meditation practice, generally speaking, by struggling to focus on our breath, but progress to observing more subtle aspects of the mind-body process. Along the way, we come to see even the breath as impermanent, making our last breath, when we die, easier to inhale with equanimity. It's a profound process of transforming suffering to freedom from suffering. To believe in this living is just a hard way to go. Impermanence leads to the second characteristic of existence, suffering, as the things we love and cling to morph into things we dislike and resist. The Pali word dukkha, which is often translated suffering, really means the mildest of not wanting things to be the way they are. It doesn't have to be some big spectacular calamity of suffering. It's my premise that it is dukkha, which is universal among sentient beings. Dukkha that makes believing in this living just a hard way to go. When we're happy, it isn't so hard to believe in this living. But when we're caught up in serious suffering, it's the hardest thing in the world to do. The Buddha often said, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the cessation of suffering. Wait, one, suffering, two, the cessation of suffering. Doesn't sound like one thing and one thing only, does it? But the thing is that suffering and the end of suffering are like two sides of the same coin. Distinct but inseparable. The pathway to the end of suffering goes through suffering. Thich Nhat Hanh, the late Vietnamese Zen master, wrote a book called No Mud, No Lotus, in which he said, in each of our Plum Village practice centers around the world, we have a lotus pond. Everyone knows we need mud for lotuses to grow. The mud doesn't smell so good, but the lotus flower smells very good. If you don't have mud, the lotus won't manifest. You can't grow lotus flowers on marble. Without mud, there can be no lotus. I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. The stinky, sloppy mud and the fragrant, radiant lotus. And the pathway to the beautiful lotus flower is through the stinky mud. No mud, no lotus. The pathway to the end of suffering is through the suffering itself, through precise, concentrated attention to the details of the mind-body process of suffering and holding the suffering with tenderness. That tender, precise, heightened awareness to aspects of the mind-body process that you're experiencing in the present moment is mindfulness. When you add concentration to sitting or walking, you get mindfulness meditation. The goal is to be mindful all the time. Through mindfulness, suffering is transformed. I've seen in my over 30 years of meditating, sorrow transformed to compassion, hatred transformed to forgiveness, and anger transformed to loving kindness. That's a whole lot of mud transformed to lotuses, and a whole lot of suffering ended. It makes it easier to believe in this living. To believe in this living is not a hard thing to do. The third characteristic of existence is no self, or in Pali, anatta. The Buddha taught that there is no fixed or permanent self, that just like everything else, we are constantly changing. Each of us has an ego made up of all the stories we have told ourselves about ourselves and been told by others since we were children. How tightly we hold these stories as truth directly impacts how much we suffer. the more closely our stories about ourselves line up with reality, the less we suffer. As a child, everyone told me I was the smart one in my family, and my cousin Kathy was the pretty one. You couldn't be both. I grew up thinking I was ugly, unattractive. It made it very awkward with men as I grew into my adult years. Now I know that I'm both smart and pretty. Take that, Kathy. Many other stories of who I was also softened and loosened during this time, and my suffering lessened significantly. As the grip of my ego loosens its hold on me, I became more attuned to the way everything is interconnected. In Thich Nhat Hanh's phrase, we interbe with everything. This is how he describes it. If you look deeply into a flower, you see that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. In that flower is a cloud. Of course, we know a cloud isn't a flower, but without a cloud, a flower can't be. If there's no cloud, no rain, no flower can grow. You don't have to be a dreamer to see a cloud floating in a flower. It's really there. Sunlight is also there. Sunlight isn't flower, but without sunlight, no flower is possible. If we continue to look deeply into the flower, we see many other things like the earth and the minerals. Without them, a flower cannot be. So it's a fact that the flower is made only of non-flower elements. A flower can't be by herself alone. A flower can only interbe with everything else. You can't remove the sunlight, the soil, or the cloud from the flower. We too interbe with everything and everyone else. The more you begin to perceive this, as your ego loosens, the easier it is to not feel separate and alone. The easier it is to be happy. And the easier it is to practice the four immeasurables, states of being that lead to happiness. The four immeasurables are loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. They are called immeasurables because when they are fully developed, they are boundless, extending to every being in the cosmos. The Pali word for loving kindness is metta. The Pali word for a verse of the Pali scriptures is sutta. This is part of the Metta Sutta. Just as a mother with her own life protects her only child from hurt, so within yourself foster a limitless concern for every living creature. Display a heart of boundless love for all the world in all its height and depth and broad extent. Love unconstrained, without hate or enmity. Then as you stand or walk, sit or lie, until overcome from drowsiness, devote yourself to this. It is known as living the life divine. Living the life divine, a life of happiness. Compassion is simply loving kindness in the face of suffering, of someone else's pain or your own. There's a TV ad running right now for Save the Children, in which they feature a small toddler-aged girl who's starving to death. Her bones are as thin as a small stick, and her eyes are huge. Every time I see her, my heart quivers with compassion. Tibetan Buddhist monks doing compassion meditation in functional MRI studies were off the charts with the brightness with which the areas of the brain associated with happiness lit up. I've read that the Tibetan monks lit up more than 800 times more than any Westerner they'd ever measured. This is living the life divine, a life of happiness. Empathetic joy is loving kindness in the face of another person's happiness. In some ways, it's the hardest one because of the human tendency to jealousy and envy. But when you can let go of those and just be happy for the other person, your own capacity for happiness expands. The Dalai Lama says there are over 6 billion people in this world, which, with empathetic joy, increases your chances of happiness by more than 6 billion. The last of the 4 immeasurables is equanimity, which is balance. Equanimity is essential to, for instance, compassion. Without being balanced in your own heart, you can easily be pulled off balance by and become entangled with the other person's problems. Adding your own suffering to the pot only increases their suffering when you're there to ease it. Without equanimity, compassion is unsustainable. Without equanimity, living the life divine is impossible. These are states that come and go because of impermanence, but you can cultivate the grounds for them so that they become stronger in your daily experience. John Kabat-Zinn says, mindfulness meditation can't change the waves, but it can teach you how to surf. Amen. Ashe. Blessed be. Please rise as you're able in body and spirit and sing hymn number 131, Love Will Guide Us.